Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to the Witty and Terrible Literary Escape Room that is the Book Club Blind Entry podcast. My name is Casey, and I am your host. Every week, I read a book in its entirety and do research into the background of the book and its author. I then send my co-host a 10-page excerpt devoid of any page numbers, a title, or the author. In the next 20 minutes, my co-host and I will try to reconcile our differing perspectives to see how much one socially distanced excerpt deviates from the meaning of the entire book. Today, my co-host is my friend, Pablo.
Hello there.
Hello, Pablo. So first, for the listeners, you should summarize your general repertoire of optional reading, stuff you normally go for.
What will typically pique my fancy will be sci-fi and fantasy. Just for example, I'm currently reading the first book of the Dresden Files called Stormfront. It's a classic sort of fantasy noir series from the early 2000s. I also just Dune. It is
Dune.
about, yes, Dune, the classic Frank Herbert sci-fi epic from the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a wonderful book and excellent, but I would be a liar if I said I had read it for any reason other than so I can go see Timothée Chalamet and not have to worry about keeping up with the plot.
Oh, so this is about getting the rest of the information out of the way so you can stand by over Timothée Chalamet.
Oh, unquestionably. And it's pairing of Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya in this movie. So really, I'm not going to be paying attention to a lot of the story, which is good because I already know the story. I read the book.
It's true. Turning to the excerpt, if you saw this made into a film, how would your reaction shake out?
I'm just going to try to recap what I gathered about this story that
yes, please summarize.
So, we are following a protagonist businessman. I believe the surname is Shirakawa.
Okay.
And he appears to be some sort of like intense businessman in this hotel during this nighttime. It jumps from what I can gather. Again, I'm sure context would be just a treat right now for this story, but it seems to jump around between the kind of average thing he would do on a business trip of this kind and also his family life. After, I would say, no less than a paragraph's worth of describing this man, Shirakawa, Armani glasses, his hands are large with long, well-manicured fingernails. He has a wedding band, just about 40. This is really where this paragraph takes a unprecedented dramatic turn, is with the following quote. They say this: "He does not look like the kind of man who would buy a Chinese prostitute in a love hotel, and certainly not one who would administer an unmerciful pounding to such a woman, strip her clothes off, and take them away. In fact, however, this is exactly what he did, what he had to do," with had in italics. And dear listeners and Casey, this is the last we hear of this aspect of this man's personality, and it comes apropos of nothing and is just truly disarming in its absence of subtlety. Oh my goodness. It's very rare that such a visceral description, it's the adjectives that disturb me so much, but like unmerciful, I've never heard that word used, I don't think ever. I think I typically associate it with merciless, but unmerciful has got some sort of weird twisted thing to it. After this sort of lengthy description of his life in this hotel room, it is a conversation, I believe, with his wife? Unclear on that detail, which to say I was confused about the Chinese prostitutes and his wife is an understatement, but I don't think that's really our concern at the moment. I'm guessing he works in some sort of software, because at one point he jokes about buying Microsoft, which in the context of this relationship is like a real gut buster, which kind of leads me to believe that some of these marriage issues aren't exactly new. And it's just sort of parenting minutia. Then, in a truly remarkable twist, it briefly returns to a person named Eri Asai.
Yep.
There's not even a way I could begin to fathom who this person is. And then it talks about a TV character by the name of the Man with No Face,
Yes.
which sounds terrifying. And then we see Arya Sai is in this bed, and she just continues to sleep as the man with no face is watching over her, which is just a truly disturbing note to end the tale on, if I do say so.
Yes. Do you remember the mention actually in that part where the author is like, something has fundamentally changed?
Yes, I'm trying to find it. They also mention our viewpoint has changed, which is a little illusion breaking, but
Yeah.
I mean, different storytelling methods, I'm sure. Night has deepened the passage of time. No, something has changed greatly. The change is immediately obvious. The bed is empty, Arya Sai is gone. So, ooh, spooky. Horror.
Yes. Then she shows up inside the TV. Is this explicit in this part? Okay, look from your face, it looks like no. The listeners can't see your face.
No. I
Okay.
gathered that there was some magical realism of the TV world crossing over with the real world because the man with no face was observing Arya Sai.
Yeah.
I did not realize it had progressed to the extent that Arya Sai was a la Mike TV in Willy Wonka projected into the television. Unfortunately, was not as apparent as perhaps the author might have wished.
Not only this, she is projected into the TV and into the room where the man with no face is sitting. And that room is the same room where Shirakawa was working.
Well, okay. You see, these are details that I did not gather.
Yeah, I'm filling you in.
I'm beginning to discern that there are some like horror elements to this story of like the bed in this room and at the bed at the TV screen, they are the same bed. And I'm beginning to understand that a little more. And only in the TV room is where Arya Sai sleeps. So some sort of strange world shifting has occurred, which is very fascinating and a wild thing to have at the end of this passage.
Yes. Also, I wanted to ask, how did you feel when the wife was saying, how was your time off? What did you go get? And the guy was
Chinese.
like, oh, I ate
Yes.
Chinese.
That was challenging.
Yeah.
I, as I'm sure was the intended conclusion, inferred that he was referring to the aforementioned Chinese prostitute, which he unmercifully disclothed and pounded. I mean, I can appreciate the wordplay of I ate Chinese in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of confusing to me why the husband would engage in wordplay about the kind of prostitute that he had when he was having his time off with his wife in largely the same conversation where they discuss who's making their children's lunch the next day.
Yeah.
A very strange choice, to say the least.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult, definitely does not go down well when you're reading it. Actually, one thing that
No pun intended, continue.
That just hit me actually was the author's choice to use pounding as the verb.
Yeah, it's...
because that's also bi-directional, and that is also extremely unpleasant.
Just generally speaking, whenever pounding is used in erotica or in erotic circumstances in non-erotic novels, I just get enormously uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because I can't think of a more dehumanizing verb for lovemaking than pounding. Like, it just doesn't work for me. I'm just not a fan.
And this author is extremely conscious of that nuance of the verb.
Yeah. And yet the verb is chosen nonetheless. This author at times writes genuinely beautifully, and I'm really glad to have had this little insert. It was like when you witness the substitute teacher who you really respect suddenly start cursing. It's just like, oh no, you're better than that. You've shown me how much better you are, and yet you're doing this terrible thing. Stop it. I was disappointed with this author whose work I had read for at most 3 pages at this point. And yet, my disappointment knew no bounds.
Yes.
So, so bad. So abysmally bad was that word choice. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this author does deal with a lot of very cerebral and psychological themes. He's received this criticism that a lot of the work that he does is extremely dark, but he returns with he doesn't view it in himself as dark because of the way that he writes. He has this very relaxed and also very Salvador Dali-ish creative way of writing. So he writes whatever comes into his head. And listeners can read more about Murakami's working process in an interview for The New Yorker taken by Deborah Treisman. I thought that the way he presents his work in general is very similar to the original intentions behind the surrealist film movement, in that the point is not to create a rational sort of meaning or structure. It's about focusing on your visceral and emotional instinctive reactions to what you receive as input. It's about things just happening and you reacting and examining not the story, not the meaning of the story, not the intention behind the story, but all of those things interior to your perception and your reaction.
I think the surrealist comparison is an apt one. I'm already feeling so bad after having just dunked on this author's word choice. You're going to tell me it's like Kazuo Ishiguro or something, just like
it's
a
not
well-renowned author. It's not Kazuo Ishiguro? Oh,
it's not. It's not.
Okay.
Although this author has a very good admiration for him.
Interesting. I've read a bit of Kazuo Ishiguro, specifically Never Let Me Go, which is really beautiful, and I can't recommend it enough to anyone viewing this. I could see some very minute sort of similarities in that. For one, just like not a particularly apprehensive approach to sex. Like in Never Let Me Go, that's a very prominent part of the story. It's just like, yeah, this happens, I'm gonna talk about it.
Yeah.
It was really where I was concerned was the violence, because I was just like, this doesn't work. I've read your work. This isn't how you do.
Yeah. Yep. Yes. So Kazuo Ishiguro is Japanese, yes?
Yes, as far as I know. I'm going to check that because I'm going to definitely look like a goober if I got that wrong.
Fact check came through. Kazuo Ishiguro moved to the UK when he was 5, so he's British too. But I wanted to ask whether that relationship and that similarity would lead you to infer that this text is also Japanese.
I think it does. And besides just the surnames and the sort of cultural context in which I'm seeing this, I also think that there are some little points. For one, just the man with no face, like in Japanese yokai and in folk like magic, there are so many faceless creatures and they are just truly terrifying. So that from a mythological perspective, that sort of tipped me off, like, okay. Oh God, I just walked over the Chinese line, and it also says same as always keeps me full, which is just good Lord, that was terrible to read. But yeah, there were numerous sort of points that particularly pointed it out as Japanese writing for me. It's comparing non-natural elements such as like TV screens and things and almost giving them a sort of natural feeling. Like I remember in Ishiguro's work specifically, there was some analogy that the static of a television was analogous to like crickets during the springtime, and it was that sort of cacophonous quality was similar. And I don't know if it's necessarily limited to Japanese writing, but that's definitely where I've seen the most of it.
Yeah.
And I also saw some instances in this. The anxiety is mounting about what this book is, because I'm just deeply, deeply concerned it's going to be like just a touchstone piece of literature, and I'm not going to look the best.
Well, listen, Pablo, Huckleberry Finn is a touchstone piece of literature.
True. And having read that when I was no more than about 9 or 10 years old, Whew! Oh, Lord! Deeply concerning.
Yes. So this, out of all of the works that have been written by this author, this would not be popularly considered the touchstone piece of literature.
Okay, my anxiety is easing. Continue.
Also, you can strongly dislike a touchstone piece of literature. So
I can
don't worry
and
about
do.
that.
Great Gatsby is capitalist garbage. I will never be a fan of it. Continue.
This is a very short novella that is called After Dark. The entire book takes place in the span of one night from sunset till sunrise. And it has been described by a critic as, oh my God, Eraserhead meets Before Sunrise.
Oh, wow. I'm not familiar with Before Sunrise, but the Eraserhead comparison is really good.
Yeah.
That is a really remarkable one.
Yeah. I thought that was a really good summation of the aesthetic of this book. That criticism was vocalized by Ben Dooley, who called this a rootless detachment, in a sense.
Goodness.
This book is called After Dark, sensibly, and it is written by a Japanese author named Haruki Murakami.
Okay. Whew. Man, it would have looked bad if I were wrong. Continue. Not have been a good look.
You're fine. You're totally fine. All of your comments were well grounded. Yeah, don't worry about it. Haruki Murakami is a author that is very well loved by American audiences in their 20s and 30s, and also well loved worldwide. So you were actually the target demographic for this book. I mean, ideally, Murakami hopes that he sees entire generations of a family all reading the same book. He wants your grandpa reading it. He wants your son reading it. He wants your daughter reading it. He wants your aunt reading it. Everyone should be reading it together. This is what he wants. Listeners can read more about this in the Treisman interview. Because many of the themes are very post-structuralist, of course, this necessarily does have difficulty gaining traction with a lot of older people, right?
Yeah.
Not to say that wouldn't necessarily become the case as we enter our 40s and 50s, right? Do you have any questions about either more of Murakami's work or the other plot points? Is there anything that you are dying to have explained?
Oh, God. I mean, yes. Short answer, yes. I already dipped into some of it with the mention of the man with no face. For the most part in this passage, I didn't feel as though there was a whole lot supernaturally going on.
Yeah.
Is that a big part of this book? I've read some sort of novellas like this in the past where, especially horror novellas, the antagonistic figure is what ties them all together. And people who have seen horror movies like Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street will be familiar that it's sometimes these just vignettes tied together and then Freddy Krueger showed up. Is that the sort of vibe that this story takes on? Is the man with no face just sort of the come in and remind you that these are all related? Or is it just something unique to Area Side's story?
This is something that is still unresolved at the end of the story, so I can't tell you. I infer, though, that Murakami knows. In his interview with Treisman, he says he often comes up with ideas for sequels to his books, but he hates writing sequels, so he never writes them down. So it is safe to assume that...
God. I'm just, for context, one of my favorite books for a very long time was the Song of Ice and Fire series. And people who are familiar will know that George R.R. Martin has been working on the next installment of that series since the second Ice Age, a very long time. And the idea that this author that you're referring to is I hate writing sequels. I'm not even going to write down the ideas. It gives me an undue level of stress. No. No thanks.
So because the temporary kidnapping of Area Psi happens in the same office space as Shirakawa, that would be a connection that you could use
Yeah.
to say that these things are created. Some more background information for this book is that Area Sai is a very famous clothing model. She's really famously beautiful. And Shirakawa is not the main character. The main character's name is Mari, and you never really meet her, but she is Area Sai's sister. And she describes her adolescence with Area Sai as being very distanced because Area Sai is the golden child whose parents send her to private school and fund her project because she seems the most likely to attain prodigious financial success. And Mari is very much pushed to the side, and she becomes this very intellectual, brooding, and neglected sister.
Yes.
So Area Sai, at some point, she has this dating exploit with two other men, and it's this double date with like her and her sister. Who goes on a double date with their sibling?
Oh God.
Anyway.
Terrible. Terrible. Continue.
Anyway, Mari meets up with a man in a random Denny's maybe in Tokyo, I think. And the man is like, hey, how you doing? Your sister's hotter than you, but I'm going to come and talk to you because this is what I want to do now. And
weird approach, but continue.
He's this very affable and also a bit light-handed man and there's this like sexual comparison between Mari and Area Sai that he makes. So Area Sai is very much this sexual object, just getting moved around from one threatening setting to another. It is explained later in the book that Area Sai has just decided to go to sleep, and she has been in a coma-like state for months. She wakes up and she eats and goes to the bathroom, which is why doctors can't diagnose her as being in a coma, but she just sleeps and sleeps and sleeps and sleeps.
Yeah, it's only that sort of sustenance cycle. There's nothing else happening.
The focus of the book is very much on her sleeping body and her sexually objectified vulnerability. Which overlaps very well with the themes of the Chinese prostitute. So there's this very interesting take on women's power and women as sexual objects and men as these very predatory, wolf-like, and rather unfeeling people that remains through the book. And the whole thing feels very dissociative, if you will.
That's a very good way of describing it.
Right. But the whole thing with the man with no face is never explained whatsoever.
Wonderful.
She just ends up in her room by morning, still sleeping. It's like everything is fine. The next time night happens, some shit will probably go down, but you won't get to see that. Goodbye. And that is the end of the story.
Gracious. That is what a remarkable thing to go unexplained.
The point is less to examine why these things happen and just to focus on our responses to them in the moment as a surrealist and post-structuralist work, yes?
Yeah, definitely. And let me tell you, I think the only thing I can really give you a play-by-play for were my reactions for this piece. Everything else, I was just like, I'm not going to form any conclusions about this because they're probably not going to be right.
I guess after reading this excerpt, how compelled do you feel towards this author as someone worth exploring later on?
I feel fairly compelled in a sort of like car crash sort of way, which is not the most flattering descriptor I've ever used.
Yeah.
But the writing is so intriguing in its sort of disturbing factor that I'm really fascinated by it. I'm very, very compelled to read more of this author, if simply for just trying to find any resolution to the story. I know I'm not finding any sort of like
Pablo,
spiritual resolution to the. Oh no, what happened?
You glitched out for a second.
I'm being Mike TV'd into the television like Area Sai, and I'm going to wake up in the morning and it will never be explained ever again.
Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for introducing me to this magnificent piece of work. I am definitely going to indulge into it more and send you all of my feverish thoughts about it that I'm sure you will have no adequate response to.
I look forward to it. All right. Thank you, Pablo. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Book Club Blind Entry. I will see you next week with a new co-host.